Well, hello everyone. My name is Monica Harper. I'm the Executive Director of the AACFB, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar on disclosure laws. Please note that today's webinar is being recorded, so all participant lines will be muted during the broadcast. However, if you can submit a question at any time during the presentation using the Q&A box, and they will be answered by the end of the webinar. Please reserve the chat for communication between attendees so your questions are easily identifiable by the presenters. If you have a question and would like to ask it verbally, please click the raise your hand feature and you'll be unmuted to speak. Our presenters today are Katie Baker, Ken Greene, and Shervin Rashti. At this time, I'll turn it over to all of them so they can tell you all a little bit about yourselves. It's all yours.
Welcome, association members. We started this session with a little snippet from a song that some of my friends wrote called New York Minute. And the concept is there is that in a New York Minute, a lot can happen. You can order a slice of pizza and eat that slice of pizza. The Yankees could go from first place to last place. And more important, and apropos to this particular session, the laws can change. And they have. They, in fact, changed on August 1st of this month, and it is important that you know what your obligations are as a result of the new legislation. This is my typical disclaimer that I put on everything just because I don't want anybody to sue me. So here's our beautiful team of people who are doing this presentation, and I can tell you we worked really, really hard. On your right, CFLP on the board of the association, Ms. Katie Baker. She's the president of MC2 Finance Broker, a broker and one with a lot of experience. In the middle, you've got the iconic and amazing Shervin Rashti, also a CLFP and the CEO of Slim Capital Funder. I found out for the first time this weekend that Slim does not stand for Slim, but you'll have to talk to Shervin about that. And then there's me over there with the same picture I've had for about 40 years now, but it seems to work. And there it is again. Okay, enough about me. Enough about Shervin and enough about Katie. What do you need to know and why are you here? Well, as I mentioned, when does this start? It already did. It started August 1st. And as Katie said, and printed, you're already behind the 8 ball if you're not complying. And again, to reiterate the theme of the Don Henley, Danny Korchmar song, everything can change in a New York Minute, and surely has. Now, New York isn't the only state that does that. This is my friend, the judge. He's going to make sure that you comply. Okay, here's something that you will get as part of your handouts. This is the reason that we chose to restrict this webinar to New York. And we'll touch on some other states, but it's going to be mostly restricted to New York because there's just too many states who are doing this now. And as you can see from this chart, which was provided to us courtesy of the ELFA, with special thanks to Mr. Scott Reel, Murari Shah, Bob Conan, Robert Hornby. There are just simply too many states right now for us to go through each one. I guess you'll have to bear with us again. We'll just do this a couple of times, but the big states, as you know, are California, New York, Georgia, Florida, and Utah. The others are slightly different in their scope. Some are still considering bills. Others have vetoed bills, but they're up again for discussion in the next session of the legislature. The important thing to realize is that each state has different laws, and that is, to say the least, annoying. What might happen, but it doesn't seem like it's likely in the near future, is that there will be a federal law akin to the UCC, Uniform Commercial Code, which is a terrific set of laws that govern almost all 50 states, or do govern all 50 states with very little variation. Bankruptcy Code is another good example of a set of laws at the federal level that govern all states. And there's discussion about a federal disclosure law, which will make it a lot easier from an operational perspective to take care of your disclosures, because you don't have to do a different one for each state. I am going to focus, and we're going to focus today on New York, because New York is new, not New York itself, but these disclosures. And I think it's important that everybody get on board, because New York's a pretty good hotspot for business. So let's start out with some definitions. And for that, I'm going to turn this over to Katie.
Okay, so we've got two different things here going on. We've got financial institution, and not to read it to you, but basically really is an entity which a majority of the voting power of the voting equity securities or equity interest is owned directly or indirectly by a financial institution. Ken has that in bold. Ken, you really want to explain the difference, because you really wanted to bold that out,
Yeah.
to kind of really differentiate things that we've seen in the past.
Yes, I will take that bold step forward. Fact is that in California, there is a disclosure law that states that banks are exempt from the California disclosure law. Right underneath that law is a subparagraph that says bank subsidiaries and affiliates are exempt from the disclosure laws. But in fact, they're not. I know this because I wrote a 30-page letter to the Department of Financial Protection and Innovation, those lovely people who govern our conduct in California, inter alia. And after 30 pages and probably $40,000 of my client's money, the response I got from Clotilda Hewlett, the commissioner of the DFPI, was, "We decline to respond to your request." Okay, thanks. New York, on the other hand, has made it absolutely clear that not only are banks exempt, but bank subsidiaries and affiliates. That's going to be important for you as you move forward, because a lot of leasing companies are getting swallowed up by banks now. And if you're doing business with a bank as a broker, you don't have to worry about disclosures. There might be some exceptions, but the general rule is that if you're dealing with a federal institution, a depository institution, a savings and loan, a federal credit union, then that oversight that's coming from the Fed should be sufficient to keep those companies in line without the addition of a secondary tier by the state.
So from a broker's perspective, Ken, that you're basically saying anything that's got FDIC behind their name, I don't, as a broker, really have to worry about much, nor does that institution, that financial institution that is an FDIC, correct?
That's correct. Although this is a broker organization, and you're going to hear over and over again that brokers, for the most part, don't have to worry about this, I think it's important that industry members understand the entirety of the industry. And I think it's important that you know what your responsibilities are and what they're not. So number one, you don't get stuck preparing documents that you don't have to prepare. Number two, you don't sign any broker agreements that require you to do something that the law does not, et cetera. So, brokers, for the most part, are not the parties responsible for preparing disclosures. Shervin has some additional thoughts on that subject, and I think we'll get to that pretty quickly, right?
Yeah, thanks, Ken.
Sure.
I could jump into that real quick also. So the terminology that's used in these disclosure legislation don't really use the normal nomenclature that we're accustomed to, funder, broker, discounter, et cetera. They tend to use the provider of the funds. And so the provider of the funds is where we try to really align it with our industry words.
Can you guys scroll back so people can follow along with what Shervin's saying? Just back one slide. Sorry to interrupt you, Shervin.
Yeah.
There.
No problem. No problem. So yeah, any person other than the financier, the recipient, or the agent who receives a fee or commission. So we have a lot of interpretations of that because we do have, a discounter relationship, for example, or we have a broker relationship, we have a funder relationship. How does all that play in with the words? So I've done quite a bit of the research and presentations through NIFA's organization. And one of the things that we landed on was it doesn't really fall in line with how the deal is necessarily capitalized. It has to do with who's presenting the documentation, who's actually providing the funds. And so the documentation, you might say, well, if I'm a broker, I have, white label documents that are private label documents that have my company's name on them. But it's really, for example, FinPac, right? And so as a broker, you say, well, FinPac is a bank, Umpqua Bank, and they're exempt from that. Well, if they're the ones that are ultimately, this is what we landed on, right? And all of this, again, back to the disclaimer and everything, but everything is based on all the interpretations and all the work that we've put in to try to understand this as best as possible. So we have the ability to kind of decipher that if a funding source, if someone's writing a check, wire, whatever it is, for the the financing of the agreement, then that is exempt, then there won't be any disclosures required. Okay, great. So then you take it a step further. Well, if you're talking about how you capitalize it, if you have a relationship with a bank that you're able to sell them paper, recourse, non-recourse, discounting, et cetera, and it's your paper and your documentation, that bank may not actually have any interest in the fact that if you complied with the disclosure laws, because they're an exempt institution. They don't include it as part of their processes to check for that. And they simply say, no problem, everything checks out. You filed your lien perfection, your documents are accurate. Yes, we'll buy that stream of payments or whatever it is. The issue, they always say, kind of like insurance, right? It's not a problem till it's a problem. The issue that could come up is, down the line, some attorney decides that they want to cause problems. They say, well, did you receive disclosures, speaking to the lessee? And the lessee says, no, I did not actually. And frankly, it was, there was no bank involved. It was this company. If they go back, they're going to try to get anyone under the sun that was involved in that transaction to have some accountability. And if they do that, they're going to turn to include the bank, right, that's servicing the paper or whatever, and say, okay, well, here you go. Where were the disclosures? Now we have to, whatever the consequences might be, which could be unwinding it, could be penalties, etc. Then the bank would say, well, our reps and warranties with the seller of this paper are that the paper that we're buying is collectible. And so if you didn't do your part under the laws that were required pertaining to that jurisdiction to comply, then you're going to have to buy this paper back. So I think part of it is, don't just rely on, well, if there's a bank involved, everything's fine. I think you have to kind of go a little bit more granular and decide who's actually funding the transaction, who's the financier or the provider in this case. And if the fact that we went through to New York partly is because just as a quick recap, and we will touch on California. California and New York are the only two states that have actually implemented everything. California was December 9th, and August 1st of this year was New York. So we're hoping that most folks that this affected or impacted have actually started to make some changes. We're going to talk about some of the real life scenarios and how we've implemented this over the last few months since California started, and go from there. So that's what I got for there.
The segue to that is remembering that you've got two statutes, one of which is a month old and the other which is barely 9 months old. And, that's just about enough time to make a baby. And this baby needs work. There's going to be legislation over this. There's going to be corrective actions by the commissioners of both New York and California. A lot of these things we're guessing. It was a valiant attempt at legislation. Senator Steve Glazer, who started this whole mess, he meant well. I don't have any thing but respect for the man for trying to turn the Wild West of leasing into something a little bit more tame. However, the clock or the pendulum, whatever you want to call it, swung too far the other way, and there's too much in there that doesn't make sense. So we're going to have a lot of follow-ups on this to talk about some of the decisions that get made, some of the changes that get made, and some of the elucidations that happen over what these words actually mean.
So from my perspective, I'm your vanilla, plain, boring broker, if you will. I'm not discounting anything. None of this is on my paper. I literally am a referral, but I'm obviously involved in the financial discussions and things like the documentation and the presentation of the proposals, but none of this is on my books. So with all intensive purposes, a firm like mine, I'm not responsible for presenting that disclosure. The lender of which I'm working with is, and I think there are obviously different types of brokers. I think that's the important thing to keep in mind, because there's ones that obviously do have their own paper or do discount. So that's a little bit where Shervin was talking about, and it kind of gets more hairy. But someone like myself, that's just kind of your typical vanilla broker that doesn't have their own paper, this does not apply to me. And I think one of the things that Ken, you and I talked about, because I've got a current deal I'm working on in New York, the customer is, a New York customer with all intents purposes, but the lender is not providing the disclosure at all. And I asked him, Ken, because Ken's actually my attorney. I've hired him after watching him speak on all these. And I said, Ken, should I be worried? Because the lender's not doing anything on this. They're not providing a disclosure. They're a true New York customer right now. They're supposed to do that. He says, no, this is not your responsibility. So I think that's important to understand the distinction between brokers and the definitions per se, and then who's responsible for what. Am I right, Ken?
Yeah, well, that actually brings up another interesting question. Apropos to licensing, in California, it's never been made particularly clear what kind of a deal falls within the ambit of the licensing requirement. And I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that the legislature does not understand this industry. So you've got a lessor in Iowa and a lessee in Minnesota, and equipment from North Dakota, and two guarantors, one in North Carolina and one in South Carolina. But somehow the transaction wends its way through California, and it touches the state. One of the guarantors moves, the company ups and moves to California. Do you need a license to do that deal in California? The answer is, I don't know. Not a lot of people know. A lot of people think they know. A lot of people will tell you that they know, but it's not clear. It's never been made clear. It's never been attempted to be made clear. At least New York has provided us something that I put up on the screen here, which defines what constitutes the determination of the association with New York. And very simply, the obligation to provide disclosures under the CFDL applies if the recipient's business is principally directed or managed from the state of New York, or in the case of a natural person, the recipient is a legal resident of the state of New York. Now, Katie's problem was
That's a separate customer, yeah.
Hmm?
That's a separate. I've got 2 New York deals going on now. The separate customer that you're referring to, that customer, their business is in New Jersey. All of their business articles of organization and everything are New Jersey. The customer, actually, the guarantor of the business, lives with his fiance in New Jersey, and he has lived there for years. Yet he has an old driver's license. I assume he's just not changed it because he likes the picture. But the driver's license is from his father's home in New York State. So my concern to Ken was like, well, what do I do? Where does this person fall? How are they considered under the New York Association? And, as far as a driver's license, it shows New York. But yet, if I can have some other sort of proof showing, no, he's really not in New York, he's actually in New Jersey. That's something that I may want to do. Was that right, Ken?
Yeah, and if you look at part 2, it says a provider may rely upon the recipient's address as shown on a recipient's current driver's license. Now, if that's an old driver's license, you can't rely upon it. But if
it's old, but it's not expired. I mean, he looks like he's 12 there. It's very old, but it's not expired.
Then it's a kind of a mess because you can't really rely upon something. And then there's, you've got to, of course, apply some common sense to this thing. And if everything points to New Jersey and there's a New York driver's license, but it's 30 years old, you don't want to dive into the New York disclosure laws because it really appears to you from a reasonable interpretation of the documents you've been provided that this guy lives in New Jersey. So he can wait 6 months till New Jersey passes its disclosure laws and live under that umbrella.
And another thing, could I do to the funder? Shervin, this is a question for you. So let's say you were the lender on this deal I'm talking about, and you're trying to decide from a funder's perspective, is this a New York customer? Is this a New Jersey customer? Would you then rely on me as the broker to get something other than the driver's license, which is, again, not expired yet, not current, to make sure that you're following everything that you need to do to make sure that this is not considered a New York customer? I mean, how could I, as a broker, help a funder like yourself in a situation like that?
Go ahead.
I would rely initially on the where the business is principally directed or managed. That's primary to where the PG might live, because ultimately our lessee, our debtor, is going to be the company and where they are domiciled, where they're actually operating. So I think that's where we would start.
Okay.
And secondary would be driver's license. I think we should jump into the APR and some of the practicality stuff.
Yeah, let's go back.
That's in the interest of
Yep.
time. There's a lot to cover. I think it's back.
It is back. I'm just going forward.
All right.
I like to move forward.
So I think one of the things that we've seen in this industry is how there's a million ways to present rate. And I think that there's a good, good business practice to try to normalize that a little bit. And so I think that's what they've done here is they've defined what an APR disclosure is, which is fairly similar to the way we build our T values and what the nominal interest rate comes up. But I think where the question might come in, or any kind of discrepancy, is how are you defining what your PV is, right? What is the PV to a funder versus what the PV might be to a client? So the client they're borrowing $100,000 for a piece of equipment. the funder is paying, $110,000, call it, to acquire that deal. How that impacts the rate, right? The rate of return to the funder versus the APR, the rate that the client is paying. And so one of the practices that we actually have implemented, and it's defined also, is it shows that there's an APR as well as an interest rate. And so those two are effectively defined based on how much it costs the funder, the provider of the funds, versus what is being borrowed from the eyes of the actual end user. And this has been kicked around quite a bit. We've talked on multiple panels about this, of how it is that we're going to actually settle on what that number is, okay? Because obviously the brokers don't want disclosure specific to how much they're being compensated. It causes heartburn to the clients, whether it's justified or not. I think that there's kind of an innate nature for clients to say, well, listen, if I'm paying an interest rate, I don't want to have to pay anything extra. But then you take that and you pull back a step and you say, you go to an industry where there's been disclosure laws for quite some time on the consumer side. And anyone who's gone to buy a car knows that when they go to the dealership, there's an invoice amount, right? There's a final settled on amount that you're going to actually purchase the vehicle for. And then there's an interest rate that you're going to be paying. And so they disclose that interest rate. What's not disclosed is that there is a kickback. There's a manufacturer incentive. There's a deal that they kick out to the dealer, and the dealers have all kinds of benefit to sell that at whatever rate, at whatever cost that they might settle on, but that impacts the rate to how they're doing the deal. So they might disclose that, it's a 5% deal, but ultimately, because of the lowering of the PV, call it, back to that same kind of T-value analysis, they're really getting a much higher rate because of that, if they're the captive, for example. And so if you keep peeling this back to multiple layers, where does it end, right? Because there are so many different attributes that tie into what the actual cost is to the actual funder, the financier, versus the amount that's implied on the documentation. So that's where you settle on the simplistic of, well, the APR, right, is the cost that pertains to the amount that they're actually borrowing, versus the interest rate would then include, if in the other case where it's in actual higher PV, because it actually has some acquisition costs, et cetera, built into it. And so because that only impacts the yield to forgive me, it actually impacts the return and the profitability to the finance company. It's not something that really impacts the other side. You disclose it, but we don't go back and necessarily put in dollar for dollar how much was actually paid to the broker. And that seems to be an adopted plan amongst the peers that I've spoken with and the different companies. And we'll just go from there. I mean, part of the challenge, and we've been saying this for the better part of the last year and a half now, is that this whole disclosure law world fell onto us because there were the MCAs were a big part of it, right? So the MCAs were going about doing their thing, and then folks complained, and then they kind of put us all under the same umbrella. We have been able to, well, through the help of Alpha and some of the other groups, they've been able to exempt true leases. So I think we're going to get into some of those exemptions, but I think that's a big point to note, is that one of the major exemptions is a true lease. We'll go from there, Ken, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's important to realize that it's, back in the day, I remember, unfortunately, I remember the 80s, and there were a bunch of bad players in the industry. We called it the Wild West. It was just anything goes. And there was very little regulation. There was no DBO, DFPI, nothing in California. And what happened was a lot of people were making a lot of money and they were doing it incorrectly. The changes came slowly, but they're not coming slowly anymore. Now, all of a sudden, the first type of commercial transaction that fell under fire was the merchant cash advance, which you could understand because an MCA, it's just a business version of a payroll loan, and it's payday loan. It's not, they're not very healthy, and their interest rates are crazy, and they managed to stay off of the commercial financing transaction radar. They're considered to not be loans. However, Virginia doesn't agree. So Virginia passed a disclosure law that basically restricts the use of MCAs. There's been some talk in some other states about outlawing the MCAs altogether. But what Shervin said is right. When people looking at the industry looked at the MCAs, they figured, well, if the MCAs are doing it, then the lessors must be doing it too, and the lenders and everybody else factoring. And so it began. And now there's a new law that I don't quite understand, but it basically reiterates what I believed has always been the case. It's called the UDAP, and it's I don't know what that stands for, so let's just call it the UDAP. But I do know that it's another anti-fraud provision of the law that says thou shalt not defraud thy customer. Sounds really familiar. The rule become effective October 1st, 23, and it just really basically reiterates the prohibition against unfair, deceptive, or abusive acts or practices. But the way it does that is by requiring an annual report. Now, I can't tell whether this is an annual report that's going to be a California annual report or a statewide annual report. I just can't tell. There's not enough information out there yet. But it does, just like with the APR and the reference to Reg Z, which is a consumer statute, so much of the change here is directing us towards consumer law. And the reason for that is because people feel, or the legislature feels, that consumers need more protection than commercial enterprises. Perhaps they do, but in my experience, no offense, but they're equally in need of assistance. I've worked with individuals who are brilliant and companies who can't find their way out the door. So I personally think that the pendulum's swinging a little bit too far. But anyway, just because we don't have go ahead. Please.
Go ahead. Go ahead to the next one, Ken.
Yeah, that's what I was going to do.
Just Matt.
I
think we talked about this a little bit.
Yeah.
Want to go to the?
We did this.
All right. So what does it look like? Should we jump into that a little bit?
This is actually a template, a template for an EFA. Now, you'll love this, but there's a different template for every kind of financial product. So factoring, MCAs, closed-end loans, open-end loans, and general transactions that don't fall into any other category all have their own requirements, substantive requirements. But before we get to that, I'm just reminding everybody that just like California, New York has this format. and the format requires a certain type of font, a certain size of font, certain language within the boxes, a certain ratio of the boxes to each other, columns, rows. It's very meticulous, and there's not a lot of room for expression or improvisation. You pretty much have to do what they do. This is just the template for an EFA, which looks a little bit like the template for the other kinds of financing. I think you'll find that you will do more EFA transactions than anything else, because it seems to work for us, and it's the best tailored template for this type of financing. The other transactions are different. So if you do a different kind of a transaction, if you do an MCA or factor, you're going to have to take a look at that. It's 50 pages long. There's a lot of different stuff that goes into this thing, but this is your basic template. It's 1 page long. It needs to get sent out to the borrowers at the same time that the borrower accepts a specific offer. What's that mean? If you send out a worksheet with 3 or 4 different types of offers, as far as the payments go, the length, the collateral requirements, that's not considered a specific offer, and you do not have to send a disclosure with that offer. Once the customer chooses one of those offers, it becomes a specific offer. At that point, you need to prepare your disclosures and send those off to your customer as a single page document. You could send it with the loan documents or the lease documents, but it has to be its own creature, its own beast, stapled to nothing.
I think it actually it should go before. So I'm going to add a little practicality to this because we're practicing it.
Yes.
So yes, absolutely. What we'll do is we send out multiple options so that it's not an actual defined offer. Once they settle on, the term that they want, payment, etc., we will then put the disclosures together with all of the variables filled in that you see. Ken, if you go to the second page real quick, just so that we could, yep, there. The second page of those disclosures have a little bit more detail to them about the amount that was provided. Now, this is the part that is blaring that they made these laws without actually thinking some things through, but they have, California never even fixed it. We just changed it, but it says amount directly given to you, right? MCA, and how much the fees they would have paid, how much the supplier would have received in this case. So like a vendor being paid, you would put how much the equipment supplier receives. In this case, California is a little bit different, but here they have the brokerage fee paid to. That is clear, but it's also left to some interpretation as well, because the manner in which broker fees are paid on behalf of the client, or are they paid from the client directly to the broker as an origination, etc. So there are some nuances to that. And then there's kind of like a summation of these, if there are any prepaid finance charges, etc. And so these go out. Ken, sorry, could you go to that first page one more time again? Yep. So this is something that gets populated in from, I'm going to touch on the future slide a little bit, just how we pre-populate these through our system. And then it has the bottom part, so kind of self-explanatory with amount that's provided, the APR being charged. Again, interest rate is something that we actually do add on as well, because that includes other acquisition costs, etc. The finance charge is generally going to be the total amount of, call it interest, that would be paid throughout the entire term. And then the total payment amount is the, payment times the number of months, and then the amount of the payment. If there's any put, I guess it wouldn't really be a lease ending, right? Because that we wouldn't be dealing with this. And then the prepayment, those two sections are actually either or. So it's generally going to be whether if they're potentially going to have to pay the full contractual balance of the payment, then that's that first one where it says the maximum non-interest finance charge. That's how we would calculate it. So that basically matches that finance charge. And then if it says, if you have additional, or you could have it changed based on the remaining term. And so that'll just say, okay, if you want to just pay additional, there might be a penalty. Like if you have a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 type of payoff, that's the second type that you could plug something like that in. It could be a percentage of the balance, the principal balance at that time. The reason why the APR and the interest rate do make sense is because also when you're defining what a payoff is going to be after a period of time, which amort are you really going based off, right? Are you going off the bigger PV, that 110, or are you going off of the 100 PV with the lower rate, or or the higher rate? So I think this helps you define that so that when it comes time for an early payoff, that could easily be calculated as well. I think that if you're going to put one of these together, absolutely contact counsel. You've got one on the line right now, Ken, who is well versed in it and could help you kind of make sure that you get it right. Obviously, we do these for our brokers. We put them out ourselves. So again, from a practicality, a broker gives us a deal. We put out those options. And then when they select them, the disclosures go out through our system. They're docu-signed. Once those come back, then our documents actually go out. So it's like a 3-step process. So that it's very clear that there is a time difference. It could be a few minutes, it doesn't matter, between the time which, as Ken said, they're not stapled together, so to speak. So Ken, you want to go to?
I want to ask you how that's working since you've been practicing it. Has it come up when it says the brokerage fee paid to, and it goes directly to the broker? Has that come up as an issue where the customer gets upset, or potentially a third party that's a vendor gets upset about the fee that the broker's making? Or what's been your practical experience with that?
So California doesn't have it spelled out that way, at least the way we do it. And we've got, sorry, that's Beverly Hills finest. Give me, there's sirens going by. What we do though is, because we have kind of the different disclosures, the different rates that are being disclosed, we don't necessarily point out exactly what we're paying to the brokers. So that's helped. Have we lost deals because of the whole rate? Yes, we've lost deals, I could say, and we've had to go back and actually, lower our profits on some of those. It's also been a rising rate environment, and I'm sure everyone's experiencing a lot of pushback on, having to pay more than they had to 3 months ago, 6 months ago, a year ago. So all of it's kind of coming together, but we're dealing with it.
Can you do that in New York? Like you were saying, you don't exactly disclose how much the broker's paid in California. Can that be done the way the laws are written in New York, the same? Or how have you started to, I know it just started August 1st, But how have you started to implement that, and what's going on so far, if anything?
So the jury's out on that. We actually have a couple of conferences set up on how we could help our brokers with that. Ken, what are your thoughts on that? Because we have talked about this with you as well.
Oh, geez.
He didn't want to touch this one, but thanks, Katie.
Sorry.
I just don't know. I think so much of it's going to be determined. I don't know the answer to the question.
Yeah, it's a tough one because the entire example that I just demonstrated from the long time frame that disclosures have been coming out in the auto industry, it seems I've never seen where we have to the auto industry has disclosed any of the things that impact their pricing or their rate. We're going to answer some of these questions. Monica, if you don't mind, we're going to jump in. But I see that Eric Johnson asked if you could do a 0% deal with a blind discount from the vendor without disclosing the blind discount to the customer. So great example.
That's the question.
It happens all the time, right? I mean, that's if you had a vendor relationship that had some kind of blind discount program to you, and you're happy, that's your money you're putting out. The value that client is getting is not out of the norm. If it's $100,000 asset, if you're able to get it for 90,000, but you're selling it for 100,000, that's the same thing captives have done forever. That's the same thing that anyone with those types of relationships. I don't see that there's a necessary issue with financing a certain dollar amount at 0%, and if there's some kind of program that you have where you have volume by, I don't see where there's a big issue there.
Well, we're going to find out.
Yeah, we'll find out.
We're going to be fine. There will be lawsuits and there will be commissioners' decisions. So a lot of these things that are kind of mysterious right now won't remain that way.
Yeah. To answer your question, Monica, I think the whole thing's going to be available. Someone's asking if we could send the doc package or the packet of the presentation.
Yeah, you get that.
It's been recorded, is that correct as well?
Yes, we're recording it and we will have the slides up on the website.
Yep.
So to kind of close the loop on this, because we're running out of time, Katie put together a how to comply list. Know the laws, good idea. Contact a trusted attorney, good idea. Create operational systems. It's really fascinating, and I hadn't thought about this comment about interest rates going up, but this has unleveled the playing field in favor of banks, and interest rates are now going up, but they're also going up at the same time because bank rates are going up. So I don't think that people are realizing that there's a couple of things at play here. And I don't know that the legislation advantage, but I do says if you're large enough, and you do 1,000 transactions a month, you better hope that kind of expensive a good use for artificial intelligence. Now, I'm not a big fan of AI because, frankly, it scares me. I watched a lot of science fiction movies when I was a kid, and I just wonder whether artificial intelligence might have a use there, if it'll autofill your templates.
There are. So just to chime in there, because we have been playing a lot with that. We've been playing a lot with onboarding, with some of the credit adjudication, and the process flow. Definitely, without even talking about deep AI, where it's actually making a lot of decisions for you, it's pretty simple and straightforward to have some decision trees put in place, where based on X, if and then statements that will carry a flow through and relate to if there's disclosures required or not, put out warnings, and then cases can be or deals can be handled in different ways, and then some of the AI that could kick in. I mean, we're just scratching the surface, but a lot of it has to do with the ability to read certain documentation that comes through and summarize what we could be able to do, what that deal may or may not entail. I mean, I don't want to go too far off the tangent here, but there's definite processes that continue to be enhanced with the use of that. So absolutely.
I just think that as a matter of making things even, that there has to be a way to make this easier.
Yeah,
it's too much work. Okay, I know we have some questions and answers.
Yeah, we have a few people with their hands up if you guys want to get to those.
Yeah, I think we're good here. And who's required to comply? Let me just run through this one quickly. Transactions over $2,500,000 in New York are exempt.
Under 2.5 million and under 500,000 in California.
Right. So it's 500K in Cal, 2.5 million in New York are the thresholds. True leases are exempt in both states. That's important. And I think that's all you really need.
Real estate secured also is exempt. That's another.
That's right.
We should probably jump to some of these questions.
All right. Let's jump.
Steve, what you got? Steve, you're on line 1. First time caller?
If you can unmute, go ahead.
Steve took a nap.
Let's answer Eric Johnson's first.
You looking for me?
You got him? There he is.
Yep, you're up, Steve.
Okay, what's the question? I was taking a nap.
You raised your hand. Did you?
No, I didn't. No.
Oh, all right. Moving.
That was earlier.
No problem.
I'm sorry. That was earlier, much earlier.
Like a different senator altogether?
I'm okay.
Carl, should we bring Carl?
Yeah, Carl.
You want to unmute yourself, Carl, if you still...
I'm here.
All right.
I didn't raise my hand.
Okay.
I'm just
I'm going to go to these questions here in the chat box where we know people did them so Eric Johnson said exactly what classifies a company as a bank affiliate. And I don't know the exact answer to that question. What I do know is there's a difference between a bank subsidiary and a bank division. An affiliate, it probably falls somewhere in between the two and is closer to a sub. I think what you've got is an affiliate or a sub has common board members or common owners, common shareholders, common, management. The division, on the other hand, means that you're a part of the bank. For example, Balboa is a division of Ameris Bank. That becomes a big issue when it comes to the issue of exemptions. Because Balboa, as a division of a bank where it doesn't have its own balance sheet and it doesn't do its own deals, all the money comes from the bank, it is exempt. Then you get another one like Navitas, which is part of
United Community Bank,
UCB, but it is a sub. And so it in California is not exempt. So that's what I can tell you about the difference or what an affiliate is. I don't know what an affiliate is exactly, but I think it's more akin to a sub. in a division.
Okay.
It's
think-
Sid or Carl, both of you have your hands up. Do you guys have questions?
Yes. Am I unmuted?
Yes.
This is Carl.
We could hear you.
Okay. The discussion so far has been, and Ken is our expert for a long time, but it seems that, and as he pointed out, you may get different versions or different opinions from different attorneys. Has anyone discussed with these issues with the different funding sources and how they view how it should be handled? Because it seems that way to us, that different funding sources, and I'm like Katie, a broker. I broker 100% of what we do, and different underwriters are handling it differently. So there doesn't seem to be uniformity, is my point. So is what we're talking about today something that's universally accepted by all underwriters in our industry? That's all I have, and I'll shut up and listen.
There's no universal acceptance of anything these days.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
you can't even talk about whether peanut butter is good for you and get a consensus on it. So I'd have to say no, but the basics are there. Somebody's got to provide a disclosure statement. It almost definitely is going to be the lender, the financier, as they call it. But on occasion, it might not be. But 98% of the time, or 94% of the time, if you're the lender, you better be sure that those disclosures are going out. And I think that's as much of a consensus as you're ever going to get in this area. And there's other things. But again, remember there are laws that are 10, 20, 40, 80 years old that are still being interpreted by the courts. This one's 3 weeks old. It's a little tiny baby and it needs a lot of nurturing. So we'll do it again in the future, and hopefully we'll have some more definitive answers. Huh?
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yep. Go ahead, Sid.
Sid with Allstate Commercial Capital. So I'm just a regular broker in California. So I don't need any kind of disclosures from my brokerage with my name or license number. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, so second question would be, I don't, when a deal closes, let's just say we do a semi truck or a trailer deal and it gets funded by the lender, I don't need to keep any records of that funding?
No, that's false. You need to keep records of funding of disclosures for 4 years.
Okay.
No, if there's no disclosures, though, he's saying.
No. If
No, he doesn't have to do the disclosures, but the disclosures have to be made.
Oh, if it was a private, like yes.
Right.
Yeah.
No. If it was a loan that was funded by a lender with disclosures, I'm
Okay.
for best practices, I'm just going to ask the lender for any paperwork that I don't have, and then save that for 4 years, just in case my licensing board, which is a DFPI,
Yes.
some lawsuit gets thrown out. They come to me, what'd you do? I just brokered the deal. I didn't do any disclosures. My names is not on any of the disclosures, but I do have records. Here you go, type of thing.
But your job is to get those things signed and have proof of signature. You also need to get those things signed and dated prior to the loan being accepted. And that means you need to have some kind of timestamp or DocuSign or something that tells when that document was received, that the document was received, and keep those documents for 4 years.
Yeah, so ideally, be sending out those lender disclosures through my DocuSign, so I have record of it showing, hey, it was signed on this time and date, and then sending that to the lender and say, here you go, lender.
That's excellent, but keep a copy for yourself.
Correct. Okay, that's just the questions I had.
Great.
Tammy Jean, did you ever get to see more than our 3 lovely faces? Or
Yeah.
did you just leave? Belisaro?
We have a question from Daniel.
Yes, I'm just going back to something that you all had mentioned earlier. Because, some customers will have their LLC in a certain city and state. They're located in a certain city and state, and they're doing business in a completely different state. So are you saying the driver's license determines what state laws that we're going to have to validate that customer under?
No. If you're talking about an LLC,
Right.
corporation, it's the place where the company is domiciled or principally managing its business.
Okay, let's say for instance that I have a customer that has a virtual office in Florida. His LLC is in Texas, but he's in Virginia.
The LLC would be the one, right, Ken?
Right.
Florida.
It's where the LLC is domiciled.
LLC is domiciled. Okay.
Correct.
Okay. And as far as most of the lenders that I work with, they have really taken over notification of the disclosures and things of that nature. But the question that I have, I think that the gentleman prior to me was talking about that, is I have not received their disclosure form. So how do I interject myself into that discussion with my lenders and saying that by law, I need to have those before that paperwork is signed?
I agree with you 100% there.
So I can jump in. So for example, what we do, and I would imagine, I don't know if, I believe this is kind of common practice, is when we send out documents through DocuSign, our broker is always a party to that distribution list of the documentation. So whether that's disclosures or the final documents, they see them. And once you see them, you always get a final copy of them.
See, that hasn't really been my experience.
Mine neither.
Okay, and then certain times I'll co-broker a deal with someone where I'll bring the customer and they'll provide the lender or their lending source, and I certainly haven't seen it for that. So I just need to make sure that I'm in compliance with that, especially now that these laws are out, and obviously I'm seeing that's something that I have not developed a best practice on, is getting involved in that process. And I'm just trying to figure out, where do I interject myself into that process early enough? It's like when they're presented the loan, I believe that's when I'm supposed to say, I need to see that disclosure on everything, correct?
It's a doc request, and I agree with you, Daniel. I think it's Daniel speaking.
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, I agree with you. All of our lenders, Shervin, aren't like you. Unfortunately, we've got lenders that don't keep us in the loop, don't carbon copy us on emails, documentation to customers. At the time of doc request, Daniel, is what I will be saying, okay, now the customer wants to proceed. They've accepted terms. We know what's going on, all the details. I've got the copy of everything I need to get the documents. Now, that's the next step that goes out for the actual documents, is that disclosure. And I would say, I've got to have this. Now there's some new rules in place. I've got to have that. But I've got, there's like Ken, I was discussing with Ken earlier, right now, that they're not even doing a disclosure for New York. And this is a straight New York deal. Like, there's no question about it. And they're not even providing a disclosure. I can't force them as a broker. My hands are tied. So what do? Walk away? And Ken said, no, you're not liable. I mean, you're not the ones that's supposed to be providing the disclosure. So if they're not providing it, there's nothing for us to keep on file for however many years, right?
Yeah, that's my concern. I mean, I tape record all my conversations, so I try to make sure that I'm full disclosure with my clients on everything, but try to stay as compliant as I possibly can regarding this paperwork. And that was the concern when y'all brought that up, because I know that I'm not doing that. So I need to make sure that I start interjecting myself in that process.
Be careful with recording those conversations, because it's not legal everywhere unless you get the consent of the other party.
Yeah, I have an announcement before a person picks up the call.
Yeah.
And before they pick it up, they know that they're being recorded.
Okay.
I just cannot do this business and not have some type of protection on what's going on in those calls.
No, there you go. As long as you have told them and they have agreed or not opted out, then you're
right. Okay. Yeah, they get to opt out. If they don't want to be recorded, they just hit a button and it disconnects the call. So,
Gotcha.
But thank you. I appreciate that.
But then Daniel, at the time of the doc request, perhaps, we could cover ourselves saying, can we give you can we get a copy of that disclosure? And then if the lender doesn't decide to do the disclosure to provide us anything, then at least we've done our due diligence on our end requesting that documentation. And if they don't have a process in place, which some of them don't, actually a lot of them don't yet, because it's so new especially for New York, then at least we can document something that we'd asked, we know the laws.
Yeah, that's, I'm going to have to do something, because certainly, I'm glad that I came on this call today, because it definitely answered some questions, brought up some concerns. So now I have to do something about it. Absolutely. So I do appreciate it.
And I want to reiterate that a lot of this will become clearer. We're really ahead of the game here just by bringing you all this information. It's not going to make it easier, but it's also going to protect you just because you've got some knowledge. Knowledge is important in this game. And, you brought up the question of, what do I do if a lender just repeatedly won't provide the disclosures? Cut them off.
Okay.
I mean, I know that's not always optimal, but.
I was gonna say, wait a minute, Ken, that's a lot of my lenders.
Yeah, well.
And not to mention, your co-broker doesn't really want you to develop that type of relationship with their lender, so that's another discussion that I'm going to have. So
there's a few discussions that we'll need to have, but and I think most reputable lenders will comply, but the ones who are semi-reputable and just simply refuse, that's
right,
a different story.
Okay. Well, I appreciate it. Thank you all so much.
You're very welcome.
All right, we have Gary has his hand up.
Gary Greene.
Gary Trebles.
Gary.
You have the floor. It looks like he's unmuted, but I'm not hearing anything. We also have Scott Jordan. Scott.
Yeah, I got interrupted a couple of times. Is there going to be a replay available?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
There are a couple. Monica, I think we've got a couple questions. Ken, this is probably more for you, talking about 5 transactions in a 12-month period. What happens if there's a 6th? Do they then have?
Well, what I know about the 5-month limitation is a California limitation. I think New York has a different one. If I'm not mistaken, New York allows you to do up to 5 transactions without disclosures or license, but I'm not absolutely certain. Carrie, are you asking? Is this Carrie's?
Oh, it's Michael Bauer. But I know from California, it's really just 1. I think the number is 1.
It's 1 because the 5 is only if you're not in the business of doing commercial transactions. In other words, if you're a McDonald's and you want to help your franchisees get started and you make a loan to them just to help them get started, you can make up to 5 loans like that because you're not in the business of making loans, you're in the business of making bad food. And so that exempts you from the 5 or less transactions. New York is a little bit different, and I don't recall exactly what it is, but I think they don't have the same limitation. I think you can do up to 5 transactions in a 12-month period in New York, but I have to look back at that. And Michael, you can feel free to give me a buzz if you need an answer.
All right, so Carrie's question is if we can provide a disclosure template on our website for members to use.
Sure we can, but it's going to be so full of disclaimers and caveats. I think it's what we call a lawyer's nightmare, giving people just enough information to hang themselves. You've got a template that we just sent you can utilize, but if you change the nature of the transaction, then you're going to maybe need to change that template. And I'd be very cautious about, I have templates, but I don't send them around. And I don't send them around because I'm afraid that people may misuse them. So the answer to that question, Carrie, is if you need a template, call me. I'll get you something going. I'd rather do it that way when we can talk about it and make sure you're not using it incorrectly.
Okay. I'm not sure if you covered this, but it says, so even if the lender provides the disclosures directly to the borrower with the timestamp, et cetera, we as brokers still need to keep a copy of the disclosures for 4 years. Is that correct?
Yep, but you don't have to read them. Don't read them.
Okay. Gary, I see your hand's back up. Do you have a question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
If you're sending out a proposal that has an EFA and a true lease option, and say they circle one of them, are you obligated to provide with the proposal the California disclosure, or can you send that out immediately after they select one of them, or do you get a verbal saying, I want to go with this, then you send the disclosure out?
Which one did they circle? Which one did they circle? The lease, the true lease?
No, say they were going to go with the EFA.
Then for us, we would just follow the normal process. Put out the disclosures in the next email, and then the docs follow right away.
So they can sign a proposal committing to the structure, then we send the disclosure?
Yeah, because they're committing, they're signing that document that you're referring to. That's to you as a broker. Then when you're requesting the docs, that's at that point when that doc process starts, where the funder would then generate the disclosure itself.
That's, we're the funder.
Oh, you're the funder. I'm sorry.
Yes, that I just want to make sure we're doing it in the proper order.
Yeah, the order is that when you have one specific offer pending, that's when you need to send the disclosure out.
So after they've selected, your next step.
Correct.
Gary, I would also make sure on that initial kind of the options terms that go out, I would make sure to put and we got this from our attorney, for example. You just put a little paragraph down there that states that it's not an obligatory binding or nothing's firm yet until they then get their disclosure, because it says at time offer is presented. It's not really it's options. You're basically providing options.
Conditional. It's subject to a condition subsequent.
Yeah.
Then in California, is it a best practice to disclose the broker fee or not? Because I thought that was the intent of the disclosure, is so the customer knows where all the money's going.
It's part of it.
From my experience, it depends on the lender. Each lender is doing something a little different. Like Shervin over at Slim is trying to protect the brokers and has a different way of doing things than some of the other lenders that are just putting it point blank, here's the broker fee, like they're giving an example.
Yes.
The reason I think that
what's a best practice, Ben, in terms of what you'd recommend to your customers?
We don't.
It's a big decision.
We're working on that. It appears to me, particularly in New York, that because there's a category that actually references, and we have it in our slides here, brokerage fees, that means what it says, and you need to get it in there. I don't think California has that language.
I don't think they have that either. I was looking back at that.
So, California, if they're going to play games with us, we're going to play games right back with them. If they call a bank subsidiary not exempt, even though it fits within the parameters of exemption, well, if they're going to be like that, then well, maybe we won't, disclose just the broker fees. There's no way. This stuff is brand new. Nobody really knows what's going on with it. You want to be, super cautious, you disclose. You want to be a little bit less so.
I mean, it's on the copy you provided, it says number
That's-
4.
That's New York. That's New
Yeah.
York. Yeah.
Brokerage paid to? Okay.
Yeah, it's a little different. That's what I mean about, going through this. I tried to do a side-by-side comparison of the 260-page sets of regs. And, it took me 3 or 4 hours to get halfway through. And I knew it would make for a very, very boring presentation. So,
And Ken,
yeah.
so what, like, for the definitions in that definition section of a broker, I, as a broker, pay points to certain finance managers and things of that nature that are participating in the financing. And if you read the definition of a broker, would, for all intents and purposes, classify themselves as a broker, even though they're maybe a finance manager or a third-party vendor or whatever, but they're assisting and they're helping with contracts, they're helping with gathering documentation, they're helping presenting proposals, because some finance managers are very particular that they want to be the one that presents the terms to the customer. And then yet they are also paid fees, but then the funder, the actual end funder, doesn't see, because me, the broker, I'm paying that third-party referral, right? But they're playing as far as definition, they fall under that same definition, but yet their fees that they get are free and clear. But I'm called on the coals to say, okay, well, I got all that money, when in reality I didn't get all that money. Some of that went to a third-party vendor that, sir, you purchased your equipment from. How does that work?
Jeez.
Because they do. I mean, I'm looking at it for the state of New York, how they define a broker. I would say, yeah, some of my vendors have check.
Uh-huh. Well, I'm not sure that I completely understand your question, but I do know one thing. This language is very similar to the referral exemption language in California. In California, you can practice as a broker without a license if you don't touch the deal. So if you put knots instead of, so
No, you just refer.
a referral source means
Right. But these people are doing more than referring. They are gathering applications for financing. They are gathering documentation. They are gathering bank statements. They are presenting, in some cases, presenting the terms. Like, I'll present it to them, they present it to the client.
Yes, that makes you broker for sure.
No, but they're the ones presenting the terms in some of these cases to the client.
But you're still participating in the negotiation. You're
I
getting
am.
paper signed. You're involved. The real concept of referral source is almost if you go to an SBA site and you're trying to get a small business started, it's got a whole bunch of links, and it may have a link to financing. That link is probably a referral source.
Right. Yeah, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about somebody that actually is fully participating, and they're actively collecting documentation with me. They're assisting in presenting the proposal to the customer. They may be a finance manager at a vendor, right? And they want control over this. And they also want to be paid a fee. Where does that go?
In the disclosures.
But my funder, so that's my responsibility to the funder. Hey, I'm paying this guy 2 points here, or 20%, or whatever I'm paying him. So that they list it out and say that vendor, XYZ company that sold the product, that's been involved in all of this, is also being paid, because it's the truth.
Interesting question, because technically you don't even have to read, let alone review or revise the disclosures. So if you see that they're wrong, and maybe you mentioned it to your finance manager, maybe you don't, and they go out and they're wrong, it's not your problem.
Well, no, what I'm saying to you is that the customer, the end user customer, looks like, from their perspective, that me as the broker, the frontline broker, right, that I'm getting all that money when in reality I'm not. I'm only getting a portion of it because I'm having to then turn around, take part of the money that I made and give that back to a vendor that falls under the definition because they gathered the documents, they gave me the application, they got bank statements, they presented the proposal, so they want a fee. So I feel like the customer should know, yeah, you're
Katie, in my opinion, that really is going to fall back on the relationship that you have with whoever you're doing that deal with, and settle on what makes sense, because that's basically disclosing a little bit more to make the client understand that you're not pocketing all of that, but at the same time it might make the vendor not be as attractive to work with you, to say, well, if you're going to talk about what's coming back, I mean, that's where all this stuff gets so hairy.
right. That's what I'm trying to point out.
Yeah.
I feel like what Ken's to keep saying, it's been so new, there's going to be litigation that's coming, and we just haven't seen exactly how.
Well, hopefully you won't be involved in that litigation. Litigation is going to be, some lenders going to be challenged as to the completeness and the accuracy of its disclosures. And if your broker fee isn't in there, there's going to be something to say about it.
Yeah.
So we have one more question, and then I know we've gone way over on time. Are disclosures required, recommended in a private label arrangement where an exempt entity is the ultimate funder?
I would say no. Exempt entity is, as long as the financier, the person who's cutting the check, is exempt, then no disclosures should be required. As a general matter.
Great.
Right.
Well, I don't see any other questions, but I'm sure this is not the end of this conversation by any means.
It's just the beginning.
It's just beginning. I want to thank you all so much for being with us today. Thanks everyone for participating. This webinar will be posted on the members only section of the AACFB website under our online video library. And if you'd like to go back and review it at any time, and thanks, and have a great day, everybody.